Pick up where I got cut off a few minutes ago. So he appealed to the University of Halle for missionaries. Now, the Moravians. One of those who studied at Halle was Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, and he kind of adopted the Moravians, gave them an invitation to settle on his estates. And for the Moravians, the contemplation of Christ's suffering, led one to complete trust in the Lord for the forgiveness of sins, for the whole of life. They had this total commitment to Christ, total dependence on Christ attitude. And it was this attitude it's what impressed John Wesley later on. And we'll see that in just a few minutes. Now, the Moravians' influence far outlived their small numbers. They had a great interest in missions. They had missions to the Eskimos, into the Caribbean, Africa, India, South America, North America. So they were all missions. They were all sending missionaries, and that obviously influenced other Protestant churches. Had a great impact on John Wesley and later on Friedrich Schleiermacher. We'll talk about in a few weeks. Now, obviously, they had tension and conflict with Orthodox Lutherans, the established Lutheran Church. And after Zinzendorf's death, who was their benefactor, Moravians broke with Lutheranism. Now let's talk about Methodism a little bit. And John Wesley, I'll let you read in Gonzales about his background, his history. But Wesley wanted more than anything to awaken faith in the Church of England, kind of like what Pietism had done in Europe for the Lutherans in Germany specifically. Wesley was a bishop of the Church of England. Never wanted to leave the Church of England, but he realized his work needed more organization to be more effective, needed more methods, and that's why they were called Methodists. So his followers were organized into societies, and when those grew, they were divided into classes, and he involved a lot of lay people. There was a lot of lay participation, a lot of participation of women. The movement grew rapidly, and Wesley is famous for saying, "The world is my parish." You know, he was not going to follow this geographic parish that Church of England had, like the Roman Catholic Church. You work this area, and somebody else is going to work this area. The world is my parish. And this led to lay preachers who would have a circuit and would go from church to church. And if you know anything about American history, we'll see this later. You know, talk about the old circuit riding preacher, you know, who'd get on the horse and ride around and preach at various churches in the American frontier, and that was the Methodist pastor. It led to the role of a superintendent, you know, who oversaw a variety of the preachers in the areas in Methodism. Now, certainly there was opposition to Wesley, and often very violent. Many of the Methodists came from lower classes. I mean, think about it. Throughout history, often, number one, revival movements, new movements come from the lower classes. And then you get a guy like Wesley who is meeting in their homes and giving them participation, lay participation. A lot of resentment from the establishment, a lot of resentment from the wealthier people. He did break, even though he was influenced by the Moravians, he broke from the Moravians because they were too quietist for them. Even though they were very missions oriented, their Christian life was more the reflective meditation life. Well, Wesley was an activist, and Methodists have that, have always had that reputation. They're activists, social action, social justice. Again, Wesley opposed breaking with the Church of England, but at the same time, the Church of England leaders resented the growth and the fruitfulness of the movement. And the big issue was a legal issue. See, Church of England did not recognize Methodist meetings and buildings. If the Methodists registered those buildings legally, then it would be officially a break with the Church of England. They'd be saying they're not Anglican. And so there was that whole issue of, well, we're meeting in this building, It's not recognized by the Church of England, but if Wesley and the Methodists register that as a church, then it's a break from the Church of England, and he didn't want to do that. He eventually allowed his ministers, especially in the United States, in America, to begin the formation of a new church. And it had to do more with the appointment of bishops than anything else. And it was all, again, entering into the American Revolutionary War and all those kinds of things. When after the American War for Independence, the Revolutionary War, Anglicans in the colonies left without ability to partake in communion because a lot of the bishops, the leaders of the Church of England, were Tories. They were against the revolution, so they left the colonies or were run out of the colonies. And so after the war, there was nobody giving any leadership. Now, although Wesley had opposed the revolution himself as a good Englishman, and by the way, he had opposed the holding of slaves, he did ordain two men to go and serve in the United States. He did that on his own. So that was, in essence, a break with the Church of England. Wesley refused to admit it to his death. He just, I'm still a Church of England. I'm still a Church of England. But for all practical purposes, the Methodists were becoming a separate church. They grew rapidly. In Great Britain, it was aided by the societal changes caused by industrial revolution. All that was happening, and this often happens in church growth and in theology. We've seen that the cultural changes and theological religious changes have this symbiotic, interconnected relationship. And so all this industrial revolution, upheavals in society, and Methodists would just go start a church wherever it was needed because, again, the world is my parish. In the United States, Methodism moved with the frontier, and Baptists did also, by the way. And basically, those two were the church planting fiends of the day. I mean, they would get out there and plant churches every time somebody drove the stake in the ground. We're going to have a town here. There's a Methodist church and a Baptist church. And when the American Methodist Church formed, it kept the Episcopal form of government, which, by the way, Wesley opposed. Well, finally, some key Wesleyan theological points. In Scripture, they approach Scripture as sola scriptura, but it's really suprema scriptura. In other words, there's the Wesleyan, the Methodist quadrilateral. Scripture is it's the highest authority, but it's not the only authority. They do place reason and experience as authoritative. Not the source of authority, but as the appropriation of authority. So Scripture, reason, tradition, and experience are all sources of authority, the way you gain and do theology in the Methodist tradition. Now, they're going to still say Scripture is highest, but the others are very important also. And you can get out of balance. Right here in Fort Worth, there's a Methodist preacher who every Saturday publishes a little advertised blurb in the paper. Just one of those little short, kind of a thought thing. And I have noticed time and time again, I read it because I find it interesting, but time and time again, he talks about experience. We can know God because we can experience God. We can know God because people have had near-death experiences. We can know God because someone experienced this and experienced that. He hardly ever talks about Scripture. It's always experience. He even wrote a book about ways we can know God. Experience. Now, this guy may be an outlier. He may be an extreme. But that comes out of Methodism. As a matter of fact, I do remember him writing one little blurb, one little article one time talking about the errors in Scripture. So, there you have it. General atonement, obviously, Wesleyan, coming from the Arminians. The law, what's the purpose of the law? Conviction of sin. It leads men to Christ. Keeps the Christian alive and growing in grace. Justification, again, a Wesleyan Arminian background, grace is resistible. And predestination is conditional and depends on the person's faith. So how is that not a human work? We talked about this already. Preventing grace. given to all. So all are capable, but not in themselves, of accepting the grace of belief. All are given that foundational, prevenient, preventing grace so that all have the ability to respond when they hear the gospel. Assurance of salvation is given by the witness of the Spirit, and there are degrees of assurance and levels of faith. But assurance does not mean that falling away is not possible, because you can, in Methodism, obviously, Arminianism, you can lose it all. Sanctification is an effect of the atonement. And maybe you've heard of the Wesleyan or the Methodist perfectionism. And perfection can be attained. And of course, it is a relative perfection, not an absolute perfection. An absolute perfection is only in Jesus Christ. So what does that perfect sanctification look like this side of heaven? Well, it's the perfect love of God and neighbor. It can possibly occur before death. It is the freedom of all sin, voluntary transgression. In other words, you're not going to choose to sin. It's like, it's not going to be the conscious commission of sin. It's received by faith. This sanctification, this perfection is received by faith. It's a process. It's a pilgrimage. It's preceded by and followed by God's work in one's life. It's not something you can do on your own. It does not make you infallible. You may have achieved that Christian perfectionism, but it does not make you infallible, and it can be lost. So you can see that perfectionism, that sanctification that comes into Wesleyan theology, how branches off from there, in some cases even more extreme in some other groups, Nazarenes and sometimes Pentecostals and others. So you can see where that comes from. Anyway, that's some of the highlights of the right wing, for lack of a better term, of the theology during the Enlightenment. You guys enjoy your week of non-travel. Be working on that and finishing up that book review. We will spend some time discussing the book when we get back next Monday. Other than that, I think I'm done, and I'm sure all the people said amen again. So we'll see you next week. Goodbye.